They told you the Follings were a gift to their community. They told you 12 children found safety in their home, children no one else wanted. They told you a story of charity, love, and redemption. But what they never told you, what they worked very hard to bury, was that not a single one of those children had a birth certificate. Not one. No record that they had ever come into this world. Think about that. Children without names, without histories, without a trace of existence. The kind of children who could vanish into the shadows, and no government, no church, no court would ever come asking questions, because to the system, they were already ghosts. This is where our descent begins. Not with kindness, not with family, but with the cold machinery of control. Because when you strip a human being of their record, when you erase the paper trail that proves they are real, you have power over them that no parent, no priest, no teacher should ever hold. You have the power to rewrite who they are, what they remember, even what they believe about themselves. And the Follings understood this better than anyone. Their mansion stood like a fortress at the edge of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, looming behind twisted oak trees like a stage set built for secrets. The locals called it the haunted house on the hill. They thought that was a joke, but the truth, the walls really did keep in something haunted, not by spirits, but by the slow suffocation of innocence, by children growing up with no proof they had ever been born, and therefore no proof they could ever escape. And here's the part you were never meant to know. The absence of a birth certificate isn't just a clerical error, it's the annihilation of identity. It means no social security, no school records, no medical files, no proof you exist in the eyes of the state. To erase a child's paper trail is to erase their future. And the Follings weren't careless, they were deliberate. They sought out those cracks in the system, illegal adoption rings, shuttered agencies, loopholes buried under red tape, and they poured children into them like water into stone. You're about to hear a story that will crawl under your skin and refuse to leave, a story about control disguised as care, about captivity hidden beneath the mask of family, a story that shows us how easy it is for institutions to look away when shadows do their work in silence. Every story of darkness begins with a mask of light. The Follings wore theirs well. To the people of Millbrook, Howard and Margaret Folling were the very image of respectability. He was an investment banker, always polished, always speaking in measured tones that made even his small talk feel important. She was a former pediatric nurse, graceful in public, soft-spoken, the sort of woman who seemed destined for motherhood. Together they turned a crumbling Victorian mansion into a symbol of wealth and renewal. Neighbors admired them, pastors blessed them, and journalists wrote glowing columns about their generosity. On the surface, they looked like the salvation of unwanted children. But I want you to understand something deeper. Predators rarely announce themselves. They present as saviors. They build trust first, and only then do they begin to twist the knife. For 15 years, that's exactly what the Follings did. They created a public image so polished, so untouchable, that when doubts were whispered, because they were whispered, people buried them out of fear of looking ungrateful. That's the first layer of control, silence through admiration. Think of the first child they adopted, a boy named James. The town threw a baby shower, the church held a blessing, everyone celebrated. But Margaret would not let anyone hold him, not even for the ceremony. She hovered, rigid, almost possessive, like a woman defending property rather than protecting life. At the time, people excused it as maternal instinct, but hindsight paints it differently. That was not a mother's love, that was ownership. And then, more children followed. 1 became 5, 5 became 8, 8 became 11. The speed at which they expanded their brood was unnatural, given the endless delays and paperwork that cripple most adoptions, but no one asked why, because who would dare question a couple who looked like saints? Howard had connections in law, finance, politics. Margaret had the perfect mask of nurturing grace. Together, they exploited the system so smoothly that by the mid-1990s, they had gathered 12 children under their roof, all without verifiable birth records. This is the kind of truth polite society refuses to confront. The institutions we trust are not just careless, they are complicit. The Follings understood that if you appear powerful, if you appear generous, then even when you are feeding on the vulnerable, you will be praised instead of punished. And that's exactly how they kept their secret alive for nearly 2 decades. Every fortress has a blueprint, and the Follings drew theirs in quiet, careful strokes. First came isolation. The children did not go to public school. Margaret said she homeschooled, and no one pushed back because respectable mothers get the benefit of the doubt. Without classmates, there were no friends to compare stories, no teachers to notice the slow dimming of spirit. The children were kept close, always within reach, always within earshot, trained to read the room before they dared breathe. Second came scarcity, not of food or clothes, but of permission. They were allowed to speak only when invited. They were allowed to feel only the emotions that would not disrupt the script. Reward and punishment shifted like sand, so that compliance became reflex, not choice. Break a rule today and learn the rule changed yesterday. This is how you teach a mind to surrender. When the floor keeps moving, you stop trying to stand. Then came the first fracture the town could not ignore. Thomas fell from a tree and snapped his arm. Margaret, a trained nurse, tried to set it herself. Bone tore skin, infection set in. Only when the fever climbed did Howard drive him to the ER. Dr. Chen saved the arm, but what she could not save was the silence. The boy did not cry. He watched his father before answering simple questions, as if permission lived in another person's face. When the hospital asked for records, there were none. Howard claimed their files had burned in a fire at a defunct agency. A report was filed. A caseworker visited. The house was clean, the children polite, the parents articulate. Boxes were checked, concerns dismissed, and the door closed on the only light that had slipped into that mansion in years. Understand what that meant. The system rang the bell and said all is well. The children heard it, the Follings heard it, and the walls around that house grew thicker, because nothing fortifies a predator like an official stamp that says safe. If you want to know how control looks in daylight, it looks like this: a house admired from the street, a mother praised for sacrifice, a father shaking a pastor's hand, and inside, children learning to monitor their own breathing so it won't offend. Because when breathing becomes strategy, childhood ends, and obedience takes root where a name should be instead. By 1988, the Folling household was swelling with children, each one folded into the same rigid order, each one stripped of the natural chaos that marks youth. They sat in church, lined like soldiers, eyes forward, backs straight, no fidgeting, no whispers. People noticed, of course. A neighbor once said they looked less like a family and more like a choir of statues, but instead of alarm, the response was admiration. So well behaved, they said, so respectful. And so the mask tightened. What should have been a warning sign was applauded as virtue. That's how corruption survives, by teaching us to mistake brokenness for discipline. Children with empty eyes don't raise suspicion, they earn compliments. Because society doesn't want to see pain, it wants to see order. And the Follings gave the town exactly what it wanted: a perfect tableau, carefully arranged, strategically silent. But cracks always surface. There was the locked 3rd floor, a part of the house no one entered. Visitors heard noises from behind its doors, shuffling, sometimes crying. Margaret brushed it off with a smile, calling it storage, blaming the house's age. People laughed, accepted, moved on. But what if the truth is simpler, darker? What if behind those locked doors were children who did not officially exist? Children hidden from every census, every record, every prayer list. That is how deep the erasure ran. Lives sealed away not just from the world, but from recognition itself. And remember this: none of these children had birth certificates. None. They were shadows in the system, and shadows can be moved, reshaped, or destroyed without consequence. That was the genius of the Follings' design. To the public eye, they were saviors. To the state, they were caretakers. But to the children, they were jailers. Identity was not given, it was assigned. And obedience was not requested, it was demanded. Ask yourself this: what does it do to a child to grow up without proof they exist? No name in a book, no record in a drawer, no history to trace. It means you don't belong to the future or the past. You only belong to whoever claims you in the present. That is not parenthood, that is ownership. And ownership is the foundation of slavery. The Follings didn't build a family. They built an empire of silence, an empire where children were currency, identity was negotiable, and every smile shown in public was just another brick in the fortress of control. Control isn't just enforced with rules, it seeps into the marrow through fear and ritual. Former house staff would later whisper about the Follings' routines: dinners eaten in silence, punishments that stretched through the night, children standing in corners until their legs gave out. Margaret demanded they address her as Madam and Howard as Sir, not mother, not father, titles of authority, not love. The words themselves carved distance into every interaction, reminding those children daily that they were not family, they were subjects. Maria Vasquez, a housekeeper who fled after 6 months, would later confess through tears that she delivered food to locked doors on the 3rd floor. She never saw who ate it. She only heard voices, young, fragile, murmuring songs to themselves in the dark. Margaret told her they were special children, separated for their own safety. But Vasquez said their cries sounded less like sickness and more like imprisonment. And yet, outside those walls, the family was celebrated. Howard donated to charities. Margaret appeared at community gatherings smiling, elegant, the picture of grace. Their mansion became a symbol of rebirth, transformed from ruin into grandeur. People admired the Folling children when they appeared in public, dressed neatly, lined in order, perfect little ambassadors of discipline. No tantrums, no play, no laughter, just compliance. It should have chilled the blood. Instead, it drew applause. This is where you see the deeper mechanism at play. The Follings weren't just manipulating children, they were manipulating perception itself. They understood that the world prefers a beautiful lie to an ugly truth, and if you dress the lie well enough, no one will ask what's buried underneath. That's how they maintained power, not just through wealth or secrecy, but through the complicity of everyone who chose comfort over confrontation. Now pause for a moment and imagine one of those children. Imagine what it feels like to know you have no birth certificate, no legal anchor tying you to the earth. You're alive, but undocumented, breathing, but invisible. You're told your identity is a privilege granted only if you obey. And in that mansion on Elm Street, disobedience wasn't just punished, it was erased. The Follings didn't merely adopt children, they harvested them. They pulled them into a structure designed not to nurture but to dominate. And for years no one dared to ask where those children truly came from, or worse, what they were being groomed to become. By the late 1980s, whispers had begun to ripple through Millbrook. Not loud accusations, not outright suspicion, just the uneasy murmurs people exchange when their instincts tingle but their courage falters. The Folling children never joined sports, never came to birthday parties, never had friends outside their walls. Neighbors who tried to arrange playdates were politely rebuffed, always with excuses: illness, homework, family trips. Over time, people stopped asking. Isolation complete. But here's the truth most missed. Isolation wasn't a byproduct. It was the design. By cutting those children off from the world, the Follings made sure no one else could shape their identities. No teacher could plant doubt. No peer could mirror back a sense of normalcy. No outside adult could notice bruises or fear. In that house, Margaret and Howard became the only reality those children knew. And reality, when it has only one author, becomes a prison. Then came the stories about the 3rd floor. Visitors said they heard shuffling, whispers, sometimes even crying from behind locked doors. Margaret waved it away with practiced charm, calling it old house noises. But at least one witness, Susan Fletcher, a neighbor and social worker, knew better. She saw a face in a window, a girl she did not recognize, a girl who wasn't one of the 11 officially adopted children. When she confronted Margaret, the answer was laughter, deflection, a smirk that said, "You will accept what I tell you, or you will look insane for doubting me." And that's the deeper horror here, not just what happened inside, but how easily outsiders let themselves be deceived. Because doubting the Follings meant questioning not just a family, but an entire system that had vouched for them. Agencies had approved the adoptions, churches had blessed the children, officials had praised their generosity. To accuse them was to accuse the very institutions people trusted to define good and evil, and most people won't cross that line. They'd rather believe the lie, because the lie is easier to live with. Meanwhile, the children themselves seemed to fold inward. At church, they sat motionless in a row, eyes flat, hands still, bodies trained not to fidget. They didn't behave like kids, they behaved like disciples, or prisoners, or both. And yet the congregation nodded with approval, mistaking trauma for discipline. The mask held firm. What no one asked, but should have, is simple. Where did those children really come from? And why were there always more faces than the paperwork could explain? By 1990, strange coincidences began to surface, though no one dared connect them aloud. Across county lines, children were vanishing. A 5-year-old from a shelter in Bridgeport. 2 siblings removed from their mother in Hartford, placed in foster care, yet never seen again. A boy from Boston, his paperwork lost in a transfer between agencies. Cases that should have triggered outrage barely made the back page of the paper. Each child disappeared into the system like a stone dropped into deep water. No splash, no ripple, just silence. And then, new faces appeared in the Folling household, always young, always fragile. Children no one in town could trace. When asked, Howard offered explanations too neat, too polished. Distant cousins, private adoptions, overseas arrangements. People nodded, because Howard Folling was not the kind of man you questioned. His voice carried the weight of money and respectability. His handshake could erase suspicion. But patterns were forming, if you cared to see them. The dates of disappearances lined up with the sudden arrivals of new Folling children. The numbers matched too closely. A girl lost from state care in 1991, a girl of the same age and description spotted in the Folling pew the very next Sunday. A boy unaccounted for in Connecticut's adoption records, a boy appearing weeks later on Howard's arm at a church banquet. A retired police officer later confessed that whispers reached his desk more than once. He suspected the Follings were exploiting a gap in the adoption pipeline, using wealth and connections to claim children who should have been protected. But he found himself stonewalled. Records missing, case files incomplete, phone calls redirected. It was as if someone higher up had already decided these children were better off erased. And that's the part most refuse to see. Systems don't fail by accident. They fail in ways that protect the powerful. Every missing form, every closed file, every bureaucratic shrug built a fortress around the Follings empire. The question is, were they just clever enough to exploit it, or was someone feeding them the silence they needed? Inside the mansion, those children had no idea the world was supposed to fight for them. They only knew obedience, ritual, and fear. But to anyone watching closely, the math was already damning. Children vanished from the map, and somehow the Follings always had room for one more seat at their endless, silent table. The further you peer into that mansion, the more it ceases to resemble a home at all. By the early 1990s, survivors who later escaped described a world built on ritual. Punishments weren't random, they were theater. If a child spoke out of turn, they weren't simply scolded. They were made an example, forced to kneel on rice for hours until their skin bled, locked in a bare room with only scripture on the walls, ordered to memorize entire passages before they could eat again. Margaret orchestrated these ceremonies with a precision that bordered on obsession. She spoke of purification, of molding the children into vessels free of weakness. Howard enforced it with cold detachment, never raising his voice, never breaking composure. His power wasn't in yelling, it was in making the children believe silence itself was his surveillance. A glance was enough to freeze them. And then there were the nights. Survivors spoke of midnight gatherings in the basement, children lined in a circle, repeating phrases until their voices blurred into one. They were drilled to speak in unison, to confess imagined sins, to denounce themselves and each other. Margaret called it the cleansing. Howard called it discipline. The children learned to call it normal. Neighbors sometimes reported strange sounds carried across the night air, chanting, crying, the low hum of voices rising and falling. When asked, Margaret would laugh it off, claiming it was just family prayer. And who would question that? Prayer is sacred. To doubt it would be to doubt faith itself. And so, once again, the cover held. But beneath the hymns and punishments, something darker was forming. The children weren't just being controlled. They were being broken down, stripped of identity, remade in the Follings image. Margaret wrote in her journal, later recovered, about the need to empty a vessel before it can be filled. And that wasn't motherhood, that was indoctrination. One child years later described it this way: "It wasn't that we were afraid of being hurt, it was that we were afraid of disappearing. Because in that house, if you resisted, you didn't just get punished, you got erased." And that, more than anything, reveals the truth. The Follings weren't raising children. They were crafting silence. Silence that could hide bruises, silence that could bury screams, silence that made the walls themselves complicit. Every system of control eventually meets resistance. For the Follings, it came from a boy no older than 10. His name is lost because, like so many of the children, his records never existed, but survivors remember him as the one who refused to bow his head. He questioned rules. He whispered doubts to the others when Margaret wasn't looking. He asked the forbidden question, why us? One night during a basement ritual, the boy broke the unison chant. While the others recited in perfect trembling rhythm, he stayed silent. When Howard ordered him to speak, the boy shook his head. That was all, just a refusal. But in the Falling house, disobedience was heresy. The punishment was swift and public. The other children were forced to watch as the boy was dragged to the 3rd floor, the locked floor. They never saw him again. Some claimed they still heard him, muffled through the walls at night, crying or calling their names. Others believed he was taken away entirely, erased like he had never existed. What made it worse was how Margaret twisted his disappearance into another lesson. She gathered the children and told them the boy had been claimed by the darkness in his heart, claimed because he resisted the order God had given them. She warned that anyone who disobeyed would be claimed too. It wasn't just punishment anymore. It was doctrine. Obedience equaled life. Resistance equaled erasure. The effect was devastating. The children folded further into silence. They watched each other more closely. They policed themselves. Fear didn't just come from Howard or Margaret. It came from within the group. The mansion had become a machine where even a whisper of rebellion triggered the gears of terror. But the boy's memory lingered like a ghost. Survivors later spoke of his absence as the moment they realized the rules weren't simply cruel, they were final. In the Follings house, to resist was to vanish, and when a child can vanish without the world asking questions, the walls of that house grow taller, thicker, more impossible to breach. And yet, despite the boy's fate, cracks had formed. A seed of doubt planted itself in the children's minds. If he could resist once, even briefly, maybe resistance was possible again. But seeds take time to grow. And in the Falling house, time was both endless and merciless. By the mid-1990s, rumors about the Falling family had grown too loud to ignore. A school nurse, who saw one of the children during a rare medical visit, reported signs of malnutrition and unusual scarring. A neighbor filed an anonymous tip about children being locked inside the mansion. Even a priest, once close to the family, quietly warned local officials that something unholy was happening in that house. For a moment it looked as if the walls might crack. Social workers were sent to investigate, case files were opened, a judge even ordered a welfare check. But here is where the real horror of the story deepens. The system did not fail the children by accident. It bent, deliberately, in the Follings' favor. When authorities arrived at the mansion, the children were lined up neatly, scrubbed and dressed, reciting their lessons in perfect order. Margaret offered warm smiles, Howard extended his hand, and the house itself gleamed like a showcase. The children did not speak, not one. Their silence was interpreted as obedience, not fear. The investigators left with nothing more than concerns noted. And when those concerns reached higher offices, they stalled. Files went missing, calls went unanswered. One official later admitted off-record that Howard Folling had friends where it mattered. Donations to campaigns, generous gifts to the church, quiet favors exchanged. Money greased the machine, and every complaint vanished into paper dust. The townspeople noticed too. Some whispered about cover-ups, others about bribes, but most looked away. Because to believe the worst meant accepting that the institutions they trusted, government, church, law, had chosen complicity, and that truth was heavier than silence. Inside the mansion, the children saw it all unfold. They watched adults come and go, watched investigators look them in the eyes and leave them behind. That betrayal cut deeper than any punishment. It confirmed what Margaret had drilled into them since the beginning. No one is coming to save you. And so the walls held, the rituals continued, and the Folling family's power grew even darker, because now it wasn't just hidden, it was protected. Once the children realized no help would come from the outside, Margaret and Howard pressed their advantage. Fear alone could only hold so long, so they began shaping loyalty, not through love, but through betrayal. The children were ordered to watch each other, to report every slip, every whisper, every hidden doubt. Margaret called it the circle. Each night the children were forced to sit in a ring, knees touching, and confess their failings. But it wasn't just about admitting guilt, it was about naming others. If one child refused to accuse, they were punished as if guilty themselves. If they did accuse, the accused would suffer, and the accuser would be praised. Over time, survival meant sacrifice. To save yourself, you had to deliver someone else. The effect was corrosive. Friendships dissolved into suspicion, brothers turned on sisters, whispers spread, not as rebellion, but as weapons. A spilled secret, a doubted thought, a missed prayer. Each became ammunition. Margaret had turned fear inward, splitting the children apart until they no longer trusted anyone but her. One survivor later described it like this: "You started hoping they wouldn't notice you, that someone else would slip first. You didn't just fear punishment, you prayed it landed on someone else." Howard, always silent, reinforced the game with his gaze. He didn't need to shout. He simply listened, nodding when a child accused another, writing their words in his small black notebook. That notebook became legend among the children, a book they believed could decide whether they lived in comfort or torment, whether they vanished to the third floor or stayed at the table. By the late 1990s, the Folling mansion wasn't just a house of control, it was a hive of betrayal, engineered by its masters, and the children, broken and remade, became both prisoners and enforcers of their own captivity. This is the cruelest truth. The Follings didn't need chains, they taught the children to chain each other. It happened on a winter night in 1997. A power outage swept through part of the county, leaving the Folling mansion shrouded in darkness. For most families, it was a brief inconvenience. For the Follings, it meant a crack in the carefully controlled facade. A delivery driver, rerouted by downed lines, claimed he saw something through the mansion's side windows while passing. He described children, too many children, crowded together in a single dim room, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. He swore some were kneeling, as if in punishment. Others stared blankly, unmoving. The sight shook him. He mentioned it casually at a diner the next morning, not realizing how fast the story would travel. Within days, local gossip was swirling again. The Folling family brushed it off, of course. Margaret joked about overactive imaginations and reminded everyone of their charity work. But the driver didn't laugh. He filed a report. And that was his mistake. Within weeks, his story was discredited. His employer received sudden complaints about his reliability. His driving record, spotless until then, was called into question. Soon after, he was quietly let go. Friends said he became withdrawn, convinced that the Follings or their allies had ruined him. By the following year, he'd moved out of state, never to speak of it again. Whether or not the family had a direct hand, the message was clear. To speak against the Follings was to risk everything. The chilling part is this. His glimpse was only seconds long through a blackout window, and yet it was enough to unravel his life. Imagine what might have happened if someone had truly stepped inside when the rituals were unfolding in full. The silence around the Falling house wasn't just built on fear within, it was enforced from without. Those who saw too much, those who spoke too loudly, were erased in ways that felt like coincidence, but smelled of design. And so, once again, the house returned to stillness, its secrets intact, its children unseen. By the late 1990s, the Falling children had grown into young teenagers. Some had spent nearly a decade under Margaret and Howard's rule, long enough for fear to feel like air itself. But fear, even when suffocating, cannot kill hope completely. Among them was an older girl. Survivors never reveal her name, perhaps to protect her, but she became known later as the Watcher. Unlike the younger ones, she remembered fragments of life before the mansion. She knew that families outside didn't chant in basements or kneel on rice for hours. That flicker of memory became her weapon. Quietly, she began testing the walls of the system Margaret had built. She whispered to the younger children at night, not to betray one another during the circle. She taught them small tricks, how to hide scraps of food, how to fake obedience to avoid punishment. But more dangerously, she began thinking of escape. The problem was the house itself. The doors were locked, windows barred, the third floor a place of terror. Even when outside adults came, the children had been drilled to stay silent. To speak was to vanish. Still, the Watcher studied routines. She noticed which locks Howard favored when he left his keys on the table, how long Margaret stayed in her nightly prayers. Her plan was not immediate. It stretched over months, almost a year. Small rehearsals in the dark, secret signals shared with two others she trusted. She knew that one wrong move could mean punishment worse than death. The erasure of the boy years earlier was still fresh in every memory. And yet the Watcher carried something Margaret had failed to erase: defiance. In her stolen moments, she began telling the others, "There is a world beyond this house. If you can't see it now, remember my words. Remember me." For the first time, rebellion wasn't just a whisper. It had a face. The Falling mansion had taught its children silence, but the Watcher had planted something new, the possibility of breaking it. The Watcher's first attempt came on a rain-soaked night in 1998. Howard had returned late from a meeting, his keys still dangling from his belt when he dozed off in the study. Margaret was upstairs in her private prayer room, the muffled drone of her voice echoing through the halls. For the first time in months, the routines overlapped. The Watcher saw an opening. She moved like a shadow, barefoot, heart pounding so loud she swore it would wake the house. Sliding the keys from Howard's side felt like touching fire. She clutched them to her chest and hurried toward the back door, two younger children trailing close behind, children she had promised freedom. But the house had a way of listening. The moment the lock clicked, the sound was deafening. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Margaret's prayers stopped. Silence fell like a blade. The Watcher shoved the smaller children forward, whispering for them to run when the door gave way. But before it could open, Howard was there. His hand clamped her wrist with terrifying calm, as if he had been waiting all along. The keys clattered to the floor. Margaret descended, barefoot on the stairs, her eyes blazing. She didn't shout. She simply looked at the younger children, frozen in terror, and said, "Go back to your rooms, now." They obeyed instantly. The Watcher was dragged to the basement. Survivors later spoke of the screams that followed, how the rest of the children were forced to listen, lined up in silence. The punishment was not just for her, it was for everyone, a reminder of what awaited those who dreamed of escape. When she finally reappeared days later, her body bore the marks of what had been done, but her eyes were different, harder. She had failed, but she had not surrendered. Margaret told the children that the Watcher had been purified. Howard said nothing, but among the children, whispers spread. She tried. She tried. And that whisper was dangerous, because it proved something Margaret could never fully erase. Freedom was possible, even if it cost everything. The Watcher's failure should have crushed hope. That was Margaret's intention, make an example so brutal that no one would dare to dream again. And yet, the opposite happened. In the weeks that followed, the children couldn't stop whispering her name. Not aloud, they were too afraid, but in glances, in the way their hands brushed as they passed, in the silence they shared when Margaret demanded confessions during the circle. The Watcher had shown them something more powerful than obedience. She had shown them courage. Her body carried scars now, visible reminders of what she had endured, but instead of breaking her, those scars became a symbol. When she lifted her sleeve, when a mark peeked from beneath her collar, the children didn't see shame. They saw proof that one of them had stood against the Follings and survived. Margaret noticed the change. The confessions grew shorter, the accusations weaker. Children who once betrayed each other now hesitated, glancing to the Watcher before they spoke. The circle was fracturing. The perfect machinery of fear was beginning to grind. Howard responded with silence more terrifying than words. He followed the Watcher with his eyes, jotting notes in his black book whenever she breathed too loudly or lingered too long. He never confronted her directly. He didn't need to. His stillness was a threat sharper than a knife. But the damage was done. A seed had spread. Small acts of rebellion surfaced, food hidden beneath floorboards, false confessions spoken to shield each other, coded messages scratched into the wood of their beds. The children were learning not just to survive, but to resist. For the first time, Margaret and Howard no longer controlled every heartbeat inside the mansion. For the first time, the house was slipping. The Watcher had failed to escape the walls, but in another way, she had already won. Margaret could feel it slipping, the silence, the obedience, the fear she had polished for years. The circle no longer rang with sharp accusations, but with hesitation. Whispers ran through the halls like smoke, and Margaret, above all, despised weakness. So she decided to restore control the only way she knew, with blood. In the autumn of 1999, she gathered the children in the basement for what she called the severance. Unlike the usual rituals of chanting and confession, this was different. There were candles arranged in a ring, chalk symbols drawn across the stone floor, and a small wooden box placed at the center. Howard stood behind her, silent as always, the black notebook in his hand. The children knelt, trembling. Margaret spoke of loyalty, of purity, of binding the family beyond the reach of outsiders. Then she opened the box. Inside was a blade, not ornate, not ceremonial, but a kitchen knife worn with use. One by one, she called the children forward. Each was forced to slice their palm and press their blood into a book she claimed would seal them forever as Follings. Refusal meant punishment. Compliance meant survival. The children obeyed, their hands shaking, tears rolling silently down their cheeks. When it was the Watcher's turn, the room seemed to hold its breath. She looked Margaret in the eye, then at the knife, then at the children around her. Slowly, deliberately, she cut her hand and pressed it into the book. But the way she did it, her chin raised, her eyes steady, turned the act into defiance. She wasn't giving herself to Margaret, she was showing the others how to endure. Margaret smiled as if satisfied, but something cracked that night. Because instead of binding the children, the severance left them marked with a shared wound. Every scar on their palms became a reminder they were in this together. The ritual meant to control them instead, knit them closer, beyond Margaret's grasp. And in that unity, the first spark of true rebellion began to glow. The scars on their palms never healed cleanly. They burned when the children clasped hands, when they passed food in secret, when they brushed against each other in the dark halls. The pain became a reminder, not of loyalty to Margaret, but of the bond they now shared. And soon, whispers turned into action. It began small. A lamp hidden beneath the staircase was smashed, so the basement stayed dim during the circle. Pages went missing from Margaret's prayer book. Locks that once clicked firmly into place began to jam. Each act was dangerous, but each carried the same message: we are not powerless. The Watcher guided it all with quiet precision. She never shouted, never rallied. She simply gave nods, small signals, subtle encouragement. She knew Margaret's cruelty could withstand open defiance, but not 100 cuts delivered in silence. The first real sabotage came when one of the boys, no older than 12, slipped into the pantry at night and poured water into the kerosene lamps. When morning came, Margaret struck match after match, furious that the flames sputtered and died. She accused the children, demanded confessions, but none spoke. For the first time, the circle ended with silence. Margaret could not break. Howard's pen scraped furiously in his black notebook, his gaze lingering on the watcher. But no punishment came. Not immediately. And that hesitation told the children something vital. Even the Follings were not untouchable. The mansion itself seemed to sense the change. Floorboards groaned louder, doors swelled in their frames, the air thickened with mildew and smoke from unused lamps. What had once been Margaret's fortress now felt unstable, fragile, alive with secrets she no longer fully controlled. The rebellion was not yet escape, but it was a beginning. For the first time in years, the children could imagine Margaret and Howard not as gods, but as humans, and humans could bleed. The rebellion could not stay hidden forever. Margaret felt it, like rot spreading through the beams of her house. The circle no longer bent to her will, the prayers rang hollow, and the children's eyes, once filled with fear, now carried something far more dangerous: defiance. She decided it had to end. One winter night, the children were woken by the sound of the iron bell clanging in the basement. It was never rung at that hour. Barefoot and half asleep, they shuffled down, only to find the room transformed. The chalk symbols from the severance had been redrawn, darker, heavier, smeared into the stone as if with ash. In the center was not a box this time, but a rope hanging from the ceiling beam. Margaret's voice was colder than ever as she declared, "Defiance is a sickness. Tonight we cut it out." She did not name the watcher, though every child knew she was the target. Howard stood beside the rope, his black notebook open, his eyes scanning their faces as if searching for the weakest link. The ritual that followed was unlike anything before. Instead of demanding confessions, Margaret turned them against each other directly. Each child was forced to step forward and accuse another of sabotage. To stay silent was to risk being chosen yourself. To speak was to betray someone you loved. It worked, for a time. Terrified voices began spilling lies. One boy accused another of breaking a lamp. A girl pointed trembling fingers at her closest friend. The air filled with sobs and screams, the sound of children collapsing under Margaret's design. But then the watcher stepped forward. Her palm scar still raw, her body still marked by past punishments. She stared straight into Margaret's eyes and said only, "It was me." Gasps broke the room. Margaret smiled with triumph, certain she had broken her at last, but in that moment something shifted. The children saw her stand. It saw her refuse to cower, and they understood. Her confession was not surrender. It was sacrifice. The rope was lowered. Howard took a step forward. The room held its breath. The rebellion had not been crushed. It had been thrown into fire. And now the choice for the children was clear: submit forever, or rise together. Howard's hand gripped the rope, the coarse fibers swinging just inches from the watcher's face. The children pressed against the basement walls, too afraid to move, too horrified to look away. Margaret's voice was calm, almost soothing, as she told them, "This is the cost of rebellion. Watch carefully. Learn." But the watcher did not tremble. She lifted her chin, her eyes locked on the others, and in that silence, something shifted. It was one of the smallest children who broke first. A boy no older than 9, his scarred palm still red from the severance, stumbled forward and cried out, "No!" His voice cracked, but it echoed through the basement like a cannon. Then another voice followed, and another. Within seconds, the basement was full of them, children shouting, crying, screaming, their voices blending into a roar of defiance Margaret had never heard before. They weren't accusing one another anymore. They weren't silent. They were united. Howard froze, the rope still in his hands. Margaret shouted for order, for silence, but the noise only grew louder. Small fists slammed against the stone floor, feet stomped, voices rose until the basement itself seemed to shake. And then came the moment Margaret had never prepared for. One of the older boys, trembling but furious, hurled himself at Howard, clawing at the rope. Howard staggered back, shocked more than hurt. The watcher seized the chance. She tore the rope from his grip and flung it across the floor. The children swarmed, not with strength but with sheer desperation, a tide Margaret and Howard could not control all at once. The rebellion was no longer whispers in the dark. It was here, alive, screaming in their faces. For the first time in years, Margaret Folling's perfect order had collapsed, and she would not forgive it. The rebellion had lasted less than 5 minutes. But for Margaret, it was 5 minutes too many. Her voice, once the law of the house, had been drowned out. Her authority, challenged. That night, she vowed it would never happen again. The children were dragged upstairs one by one. Howard said nothing as he moved through them, his grip iron, his silence more terrifying than rage. Margaret carried a small brass bowl and a bundle of reeds tied with twine. At first the children thought it was another ritual of prayer. They were wrong. What followed was not meant to purify, it was meant to brand. Each child was forced to kneel while Howard held them still. Margaret dipped the reeds into the bowl, then pressed them, smouldering against bare skin. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. Screams echoed through the mansion, sharp and endless, as each child was scarred. They were marked not on the palms this time, but on their shoulders, seared with the crude shape of a circle. Margaret called it the seal of obedience. She told them the world outside would see the mark and know they belonged to her, that they would never be free. The watcher endured last. Margaret pressed the reeds so deep her skin blistered instantly, holding them there long after the others had been released. The pain was unbearable, but the watcher refused to scream. She clenched her teeth until blood filled her mouth, refusing Margaret the victory of hearing her break. When it was over, the children were left in the dark, their skin raw and smoking, their sobs muffled into silence. Margaret told them the rebellion had been buried. Howard closed his black notebook with a snap, as if sealing the record of their suffering forever. But Margaret was wrong. The scars didn't bury the rebellion, they bound it tighter. Every time a child brushed their shoulder, every time the pain flared, they remembered not just the cruelty of Margaret Folling, but the moment they had screamed together, risen together. The seal of obedience became, in secret, a seal of war. The mansion was quiet again, but the silence was different now. Not the heavy, suffocating silence Margaret had cultivated for years, but the kind that comes before a storm. The children lay in their beds, their shoulders blistered and throbbing, the smell of burned flesh still clinging to the air. They couldn't sleep. Every time they shifted, the pain tore through them, but beneath it was something stronger. Resolve. The watcher moved carefully between them that night, whispering in fragments so quiet they barely carried past the blankets. Words like soon, and together, and outside. Her voice wasn't a command. It was a reminder. The rebellion had been crushed in blood, but the children now understood a truth Margaret had never wanted them to see. She could hurt them, scar them, even mark them forever, but she could not stop them from choosing. That choice was forming in the dark. The older children began watching the routines more closely. They noted when Howard locked the doors, when Margaret left her keys on the mantel, how the storm shutters rattled at night when the wind was high. They remembered which floorboards squealed and which ones stayed silent. Small conspiracies blossomed, a piece of bent wire stolen from the sewing room, a candle stub hidden in a shoe, water siphoned into jars from the pump when no one was looking. The mansion, once a prison, became a map. Every shadow held a possibility. And always the watcher was at the center, not ordering, not ruling, but anchoring. The scars on her shoulder matched theirs. Her silence carried the weight of their screams. When the younger ones trembled, she steadied them. When the older ones hesitated, she pressed them forward. For the first time, escape was not a dream whispered in fear. It was a plan. The mansion had taken their voices, their skin, their childhoods. Now, it would take something back, their footsteps leaving it behind. The night of the attempt came suddenly, almost without warning. A storm rolled in from the north, wind howling through the eaves, rain lashing against the shutters. Thunder masked the creak of the floorboards as the children moved one by one from their beds to the hallway. The watcher led them, her scarred palm pressed to the cold wall as if feeling for a pulse in the house itself. The older ones carried the stolen jars of water, the bent wire, the candle stub. The younger ones clung to each other, eyes wide, their breath sharp and fast. They made it to the back stairwell without a sound. Howard's heavy footsteps were absent, and Margaret's chanting in her locked room rose and fell like a fevered hymn. It felt, for once, like the mansion was on their side, but the door did not open. The boy with the wire worked the lock until his fingers bled. The tumblers refused to turn. They tried another door, then another. Each one rattled, shook, then held firm. The shutters, too, would not budge. The storm outside roared louder, but the windows stayed sealed as if welded to the frames. Panic rippled through the group. This wasn't just locks and keys. The house itself was holding them in. The watcher placed her hand against the door, her scar pressed into the wood. She whispered something no one else could hear, then turned back to the others. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with recognition. The mansion wasn't just Margaret's fortress. It was alive. The circle, the severance, the symbols carved into the floor, they weren't just rituals, they were bindings. Margaret had chained the children not only to her will, but to the house itself. And if they wanted to escape, they would have to break something far older and darker than a lock. The storm raged for hours, but by dawn the children had returned to their beds, defeated and trembling. Not even the watcher could explain what they'd felt. The doors resisting, the shutters sealed, the air itself pressing against them as if the house had lungs and breath. But the watcher did not give up. The next days were spent probing the mansion in silence. Every hallway, every boarded room, every crack in the floorboards became a clue. She listened when the wind moved strangely through the walls. She pressed her ear to the stone in the cellar and heard something beneath the earth, something steady, like a second heartbeat. It was there, in the cellar, that she found it. Behind the old coal bin, half buried in dust and rubble, a seam in the stone revealed itself. She scraped at it with her nails until a thin section of wall crumbled away, exposing a narrow shaft of air. From inside came the smell of rot and damp earth. One night, when Margaret's voice was rising in prayer upstairs, the children gathered around the hole. With the help of the older boys, they widened it, stones grinding loose until a black passage yawned open. Cold air spilled out, carrying the smell of something ancient, something untouched for decades. They lit the candle stub and lowered themselves into the dark. The passage sloped downward, carved rough into the earth. Symbols, the same as those in the circle, were gouged into the walls, only here they looked older, less precise, as if drawn by desperate hands. The watcher traced them with her fingers, recognizing fragments of Margaret's chants. These weren't inventions, they were inheritances. At the end of the passage, they found a chamber. It was small, circular, with a dirt floor stained darker than soil should ever be. In the center stood a stone slab, and upon it the remains of something half-human, half-decayed. Bones twisted wrong, skull elongated, jaw too wide. The children recoiled, but the watcher stepped closer, her face pale in the flicker of the candle. The mansion's foundation was not stone, it was sacrifice, and Margaret Folling had built her power on top of it. The children had barely scrambled back through the narrow passage when they heard it. Margaret's voice, rising not in prayer but in fury. It shook the cellar walls. Howard's boots thundered overhead, the black notebook clutched in his fist. Somehow she had known. The watcher tried to usher the younger ones back into their beds, but it was too late. Margaret descended the cellar stairs, a lantern blazing in her hand, her face shadowed and hollow with rage. The light caught the crumbled stones where the children had pried open the passage. Her eyes followed the trail of dust on their skin, the candle stub still burning in the corner. "You've seen it," she whispered. Her voice was calm, too calm. She set the lantern down and began to unroll a length of red cloth from her arms. Symbols stitched in black thread gleamed in the light, identical to those carved into the foundation chamber. This house breathes because of what lies below. It binds us, it feeds us, it protects us from the chaos outside. And you, her eyes swept across the children, landing on the watcher. You would unmake it. Howard pulled the coal bin aside with a crash, exposing the passage. Margaret raised the red cloth high, chanting words so low they seemed to crawl across the stone. The cellar air grew heavy, pressing against their lungs. The candle flame sputtered, then bent as if being pulled downward into the hole. The children clung to one another. The watcher stood at the front, shoulders blistered, palms scarred, her face lit by the trembling lantern glow. Margaret's chant grew louder, her voice carrying into the shaft until the earth itself seemed to answer. From below came a groan, wet and deep, as if something was stirring awake in the chamber they had just fled. The house was alive, but now, so was what slept beneath it. Margaret's ritual was not meant to punish this time, it was meant to bind them all forever. The cellar shook as Margaret's chant reached its peak. Dust rained from the beams, the lantern flame stretched tall and thin, and the sound from below grew into a roar, a voice without words, ancient and starving. The children screamed, but Margaret did not falter, her arms spread wide, the red cloth snapping like a banner in the storm. Howard clutched the black notebook, scribbling furiously as if recording every syllable would save him from what was coming. The ground split. From the passage burst a wind that reeked of rot and iron. The candle guttered out, leaving only the lantern to cast monstrous shadows against the walls. Something massive stirred in the dark below, its weight pressing against the floor as if it might claw its way up into the cellar. But Margaret had miscalculated. The house was bound, yes, but it was bound in both directions. The chamber below had not only held the sacrifices of the past, it had held the hunger of whatever had been buried there. By tearing open the seal, Margaret had given it breath. The walls cracked. The circle carved into the cellar floor began to glow, faint at first, then blinding. The children fell to their knees, clutching their burned shoulders as the scars seared with new heat. The watcher forced herself upright, blood dripping from her bitten lips. She saw Margaret not as a keeper, but as prey. The entity below wasn't hers to command, it was hers to feed. Howard realized it too late. He dropped the notebook, his face ashen, and reached for Margaret's arm. She shoved him aside, her voice breaking into a scream as she tried to finish the chant. The floor of the passage gave way. Something black and wet surged upward, grasping at the air like 1,000 hands. The lantern shattered, darkness swallowed the cellar. The last thing the children saw before the light died was Margaret's face, eyes wide, mouth open, the red cloth twisting around her like a shroud as the mansion itself began to collapse under the weight of what she had unleashed. And then, silence.